Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver spoke to the media as the Dolphins wrapped up their mandatory minicamp and shared some insights into his defensive philosophy beyond what we got in his introductory presser.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today on the show, we're looking into some of the things that Anthony Weaver shared with his insight during his press availability as the Dolphins wrapped up minicamp, and thought he had some really great quotes. This is a mystery element for the Dolphins as far as exactly what this is going to look like. He's been influenced by a lot of really successful defensive coaches, from Rex Ryan to Romeo Crennel to Wink Martindale to Mike McDonald, and there's room and wiggle room, if you will, for each one of those ideologies to bleed through a little bit. And Anthony Weaver touched on quite a bit during his press availability. It was about 10 minutes long. And the first one that caught my eye was about the linebacker position. This is a room that the Dolphins have seemingly made an effort to overhaul and revamp this offseason. I don't want to get into that a little bit here first on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So here's Anthony Weaver on the linebacker room that this team has going into the 2024 season.
First off, I love that room, right? You talk about a room that brings juice and attacks the day every single day. It's them, right? And it's led by Joe Barry, who does a tremendous job with them. In this league, with the way offenses are trying to attack you both vertically and horizontally and trying to space out the entire field, you better have linebackers can do that. It's not like back in the day when I was playing, right? And you're getting a lot of lead and ISO, and you better have a guy that's going to thumper and throw it up in there. The league has kind of transitioned away from that. So you still need physicality there, but at that position, you better have athletes. And fortunately, I think we have a bunch in there.
So that is kind of one of the evolutions of the game, and you're waiting to see what team is really going to embrace the zag when everyone else is zigging and chasing athletes and guys who are capable of playing in space, to say, okay, we want to be a team that does just transition back to getting downhill and running right at you. But for Miami to transition away from, in recent years, guys like Elandon Roberts, and I think Jerome Baker was a pretty well-rounded player. I think maybe he was a jack of all trades, but not really a master of any. It felt like his biggest impact as a splash playmaker for Miami was from a pass rush perspective. Do I think he got slept on a little bit by Dolphins fans? Sure. I think that's probably a fair assessment as far as the value that he brought to the Dolphins for so long. But the style of linebackers that they have gone after in David Long, and now what they're bringing into the fray with Jordan Brooks, and then you also have Anthony Walker as a linebacker from Cleveland who has had good pass game metrics in recent years, but kind of his initial reputation was that of a run stopper. You're seeing the embodiment of what Anthony Weaver was talking about. Jordan Brooks, first-round pick, built like a first-round linebacker, and has very dynamic range. And when teams structurally these days, has been a talking point this offseason on Locked On NFL Scouting that I do with Joe Marino. When teams play these structural two high safety shells, the stress no longer is about that high post player in the middle of the field. When it was the Legion of Boom in 2013 and they played a bunch of cover three and everybody was chasing that model for that Seattle had set, the challenge that came with that was that high post safety player had to cover a lot of ground. And if you didn't have a player that could do that, you were going to struggle to have success doing that. And teams had success attacking that with either verticals up the seams, or they would run these deep crossers and run the safety off, and then the safety would have to trigger and try and cut simultaneously. And it just, the math didn't math, right? But now that you're playing two high safeties with more frequency, there's less grass that those guys have to cover, and they are by design playing at a greater depth to prevent explosive plays down the field. Now the conflict players are more of the linebackers because they have to get into their run reads. They have to scrape over the top if it's outside run. They got to turn around and get depth and hunt crossers if they're getting attacked with rollouts or nakeds or crossing routes across the middle of the field. And because the safeties are playing deeper, the second level is now experiencing the stretch and the conflict at a higher level. And that's kind of what Anthony Weaver's alluding to there without directly alluding to that talking point that we've had on Locked On NFL Scouting. But you think about David Long, and David Long maybe didn't have good pass game metrics in 2023 with the Dolphins, but nobody in the middle of the field did, right? There was too much, I think, new with Fangio and the calls and too much interruption with players that were coming in and coming out. And it never really felt like it clicked into place for the Dolphins in that regard. But David Long in Tennessee was known for his pass game prowess. Jordan Brooks was drafted basis off of his athleticism and profile to play in space as a 3-down linebacker. The Dolphins have gotten a pair of guys now that you would at least assume, along with if the other player in the core, well, maybe not an outside corner, but if we're going to run base nickel, Jalen Ramsey's going to be in the core more often. You got those three guys kind of attacking your middle of the field, and now it becomes much more of, okay, we're going to try and turn this and funnel this into, you're going to have to win outside the numbers and down the field on us, as compared to gouging us in the middle, which is where the Dolphins have seemingly, against tight ends, slot receivers, running backs, have had fits for years. So to hear Anthony Weaver talk about that group and how you have to be able to play with the game is being played these days, I think is a really good level of self-awareness for a Dolphins team that has had their hardships in that specific area, and having 3-down players and the versatility needed to have success on passing downs with their linebacker core. Now, we also talked about the defensive line talent, the makeup of the guys that they want. Thought that was interesting. We're going to get into that next year on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, so make sure that you stick with us. Passion, drive, and patience are not just the formula for winning championships. It's also what helps to keep your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices that you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home the dub. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit available only to U.S. customers. Anthony Weaver asked about the makeup of the room. And it was one of the kind of central themes of all the press availabilities this week at minicamp was, are you looking for anybody else? Do you have eyes for anybody else? Do you think you're going to go out? And it was asked to Mike McDaniel. Mike McDaniel was very quick to say, that's Chris Greer's job. Anthony Weaver asked about his group in particular. And then he was also asked about like the rotational element. And I'll give you the quote from the part that's not on the clip here. But Anthony Weaver said, I'm half Samoan. The saying is the first wave of the tsunami does damage, but the second wave does the most damage. And that's alluding to the depth and rotation of this defensive line that he is trying to implement for this Dolphins defense. So here's Anthony Weaver on the makeup of the guys that he wants in his defensive line room.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you need to have the right balance of guys who I like to call grinders, right? Guys who are going to go there and change the math in the middle, whether that's with mass or just elite technique. And then you need your guys that are kind of in between, that are tweeners, guys that can both do that, yet are athletic enough and have the skill set to both win in pass rush, whether that's be with power or with finesse. So you're always looking for the right balance and combination of that, and making sure that you have enough of each. I think we have that. I think we have that. I think a lot of the guys may not necessarily be household names, but I think they're all guys that have had a taste of production in this league, and their best years are probably yet to come.
Obviously, Miami betting on the player development element of the defensive line in particular in picking up the slack beyond Christian Wilkinson. We'll see if they do ultimately end up tapping into a veteran at some point or getting an extra player acquisition into that room. I would not be surprised if that is still the case, even though Anthony Weaver here very complimentary of guys like Benito Jones, and who comes to mind when you say you're going to change the math based on mass. That to me is Benito Jones. As a big-bodied player who absorbs blocks, you have to use at least a player and a half to secure him. And if you do indeed do that as a nose tackle, then what you end up with is somebody else in the box potentially running free. Now, do I think that's still an upgradable opportunity for Miami? Sure, I do, personally. But I also haven't been up here for part of minicamp, and Benito Jones did play his best season last year in Detroit. So are they banking on getting a better version of that? Presumably so. And then talking about specialized players, guys that can win with either speed or power from a pass rush perspective that maybe aren't necessarily the grinders that change the math with elite technique or mass. I think about some of the rotational skill specific guys, guy like Neville Gallimore makes a lot of sense. I think maybe Jonathan Harris might be more towards the first half as a grinder for me. It'd be really fun to kind of sit down and pick through that whole room and point to each individual player and try to put them in the buckets of the verbiage that Anthony Weaver just gave us. But there's certainly a picture that's painted with what their expectations are for this room. And I go back to Anthony Weaver and Mike McDaniel and the statement that Mike McDaniel made when Anthony Weaver was hired, and them being in sync about the idea that player development is central to long-term success in the NFL. They're very clearly banking on that with all of these young players that, as Anthony Weaver said, they've had a taste of success, but their establishment as viable NFL starters, it's still up in the air. And us as fans, you look at that from the outside looking in, and it's a little unsettling because there's an element of unknown and uncertainty. And we've seen the Dolphins in years past make some bets, maybe not necessarily with the interior defensive line, although I would say it's fair to say they made a bet on that group last year by only carrying 4 guys. And Wilkins, Sealer, Raekwon Davis, and Deshaun Hand. I think it would be fair to say they were playing with fire there, because what happens if one of those guys goes down and it's one of the big, if it was one of the big 2 last year, you'd have been in a really difficult spot. You'd have been in a really difficult spot. And I don't think it would have been a fair expectation for Brandon Peely to come in and provide the kind of value as like the next man up type of option. I got away with it last year, but we've seen them not get away with it in other spots. So I think that's why for Dolphins fans, that element of unknown, knowing that they're to some degree betting on themselves to develop some of this talent, is unnerving, because it can go right and it can go wrong, and the variance of outcomes is large. But I guess the good news, or if you're looking for the optimistic point of view, I think there's enough bodies in that competition. Someone will emerge to be a viable option. Now, whether they're a viable option in every facet of the position or not, that's a different story. But I think they have enough rounds in the chamber, hypothetically speaking, that they're not going to shoot off all blanks with this group of interior defensive linemen. They'll get somebody throughout the course of training camp that they're like, hey, this guy through the course of the competition is probably going to be the de facto next guy in line, and we feel pretty good about it. Now, whether he becomes a Pro Bowl player like Christian Wilkins had the caliber of being or not, probably not. At least not this year, and probably not next year. But they're moneyballing it, right? So he also talked about the culture of the coaching staff and the change. There's a lot of upheaval on the defensive staff, a lot of upheaval on the defensive personnel. We'll talk a little bit about that with Anthony Weaver and his clips courtesy of the Miami Dolphins. That's next year on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. I know he does extend the invitation, Anthony Weaver, for the media to come down and check out the pickup basketball game and the defensive coaching staff. I probably wouldn't mind seeing it. Here's Anthony Weaver on the large-scale changes of his coaching staff and the coaching culture that they're trying to cultivate as part of the Miami Dolphins, which is a little bit of a contrast versus some of the water and oil that sounds like this group experienced last year with their former defense coordinator, Vic Fangio.
Between me and Mike, we obviously wanted to build a group of guys that not only had high FBI, right, football intelligence, but more importantly, you wanted a bunch of guys that actually cared about their players. And I think from top to bottom, we have that. To me, ultimately on every team, the teams that I've been a part, that actually cared for one another, where they hung out outside of the building, they cared about their families, their wives, their girlfriends, their kids, that's transcending, right? So now when you're out there playing next to somebody, you're not just playing for him, but you're playing for him and his family and everybody he cares about too. So I think as a staff defensively, I'm always trying to feed into that and making sure we're as close as we can possibly be, because when adversity does inevitably hit, those are the type of guys you want to be in the foxhole with.
I think that last bit's a little interesting to me too, as far as when adversity hits. When you consider the Dolphins defense down the stretch, right? They had the rough first week showing against the Chargers, and then they turned things around, and the run defense was much more improved. And by midseason, they were trending. They get Jalen Ramsey back, and they're trending like a top 8 unit in the league in most significant defensive statistical categories. And then what happens? Well, then Jalen Phillips goes down, right? And then from there, you have a host of other injuries that start to log up. Javon Holland goes down and he misses time. You're late in the game on Monday Night Football against the Titans. And in that moment of adversity, I remember very keenly Hard Knocks. And Mike McDaniel in the meeting with the team after the game, providing all these examples of guys not trusting the scheme, trying to overextend themselves to make plays. That inherent trust kind of felt like it was fractured. And then you get to the Baltimore game and you give up a 50-burger to the Ravens. And then you really do get outplayed by Buffalo, but you get the good breaks in the game to keep yourself into the game. A couple turnovers, the end of first half possession that ends on the 1-yard line because of the gutty play by Jerome Baker. And it didn't really feel like down the stretch because of kind of the lack of trust, the lack of the adversity with some of the player injuries. Felt like Fangio didn't trust players beyond a certain number of players. I remember it was midseason and you're like, look, if you're not one of these 13 guys, you're not playing defensively for the Dolphins. You're just not. And then the injuries start happening and those guys come in and the players try to start doing too much. And it snowballed on them, right? Defensively, and there's plenty of blame to go around for all parties, whether it's the head coach and the play calling or the quarterback or the offensive line or the injuries at wide receiver or the defensive performance at the end. It all factors. And I know one thing that's really popular with football fans is trying to isolate an individual variable and say, well, it's this fault. And a lot of times it's easy to say, well, it's the head coach's fault. Well, it's the play caller's fault. Well, it's the quarterback's fault. And it's obviously much more complex than that. But for the Dolphins last year, that specific part of it jumps off the tape to me to hear Anthony Weaver talk about. That's what they're trying to cultivate, because that was the exit interview feedback that they got, was it did not exist. And you're seeing it start to, based on free agents that choose to come here. They want to play for Mike McDaniel. And they want to play for the Dolphins. There's momentum going in the right direction here. Now, if you can really tweak the whole thing through and get it right, I think that's where you could really catch some lightning in a bottle, particularly defensively. And from a personnel standpoint, there's a lot of big changes that have happened. And I think many of them were necessary. So just look at some of the outgoing personnel. And I got a couple different defensive statistics for you here, right? And this is not team chemistry, But the question alluded to coaching staff turnover and in turn kind of personnel turnover on the defensive side of the ball and what they want to be on that side of the ball. I don't think the upheaval of changes is necessarily a bad thing when you consider missed tackles. This is all according to Pro Football Reference. The worst missed tackle rate in the Dolphins last year was Emmanuel Agba, 16.7%. He's no longer here. Bradley Chubb is next, and it felt like Bradley Chubb, every one of those missed tackles felt like it was a sack. He was really close to having like 15-plus sacks last year. He was credited with 14 missed tackles on the season. Kader Kohou is next in line. Kind of feels like he's relegated a little bit with the safety pairing of Holland and Poyer and Ramsey, and they bring in Kendall Fuller and Cam Smith. They've been very effusive of their encouraging words for as well. They bring back Nick Needham. I think there's a lot of competition there for Kader Kohou to find a way to regain some of the glow that he had his rookie season. The next full-time player for you is Brandon Jones. He's gone. He had 12.5% missed tackle rate. The next full-time player after that is Jerome Baker and 12.5%, and he's gone. And the next highest meaningful snap takers after that are Xavier Howard and Eli Apple. And they're both at 11.5% or higher for missed tackle rates, and they're both gone. So almost all of your highest incidences of missed tackles on the season are no longer with the team. Look at it from a coverage standpoint. Guys who played meaningful snaps and had the highest passer rating allowed against them on the season, according to Pro Football Reference. Deshaun Elliott, passer rating in 39 targets of 141, no longer with the team. Kader Kohou, we've already mentioned and acknowledged. The next one in line is, from a meaningful snap perspective, Duke Riley in coverage. And Duke Riley was the third linebacker last year. The team replaced Jerome Baker and added another buffer bumper player in Anthony Walker to the linebacker room to make sure Duke Riley, assuming he makes the roster to be a core special teams player, is allowed to just be a core special teams player. And if somebody gets hurt, he's not called up right away to play your defense. Defensive players who gave up the most yards after catch in coverage. Kader Kohou, number one. He also was credited in Pro Football Reference with the most touchdowns conceded this past season with 8. Difficult transition from a very man-heavy scheme to the zone match stuff. And you saw that. The big play with CeeDee Lamb in the touchdown against the Cowboys was him and Deshaun Elliott not on the same page. Who's taking 2, and it's their best player if he breaks inside. You're both looking at him run by you. Jerome Baker, number 2 on this list, most yards after catch conceded, no longer with the team. Number 4 on this list, Deshaun Elliott, no longer with the team. Number 5 on this list, Eli Apple, no longer with the team. So many of the worst performers in a number of significant defensive statistics as far as like efficiency, that turnovers happened. So that, plus what they're chasing from an intangibles perspective, I think puts you in a nice position to have some healthy changes on the defensive side of the ball. Kind of felt like this was last year was the scheme departure from the Brian Flores era. This year feels more like the talent departure from the Brian Flores era. The transition's a little bit more complete now. That is going to do it for us here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. I hope you guys enjoyed this chat on Miami, all things Dolphins. I will be back again soon. We'll see if we get any news over the weekend. If we do, I'll have you covered. And if not, I'll be back again on Monday. Fins up. Enjoy your weekend. I'll talk to you all again soon.